long. And for those who've seen earlier versions of this talk, I apologize, but there's some new stuff in here, so hopefully there's something for everyone. So the talk is kind of provocatively titled Where the MIZ Really Is, and it's kind of throwing a bit of shade on the sea ice concentration definition of the MIZ, but we'll come to that a bit later. Before we get to that, I want to thank this cast of wonderful people here for contributing to this work. Okay. My clicking's not working. This is a good start. Here we go. So I probably don't need to introduce what the MIZ is to this group, so I won't spend a whole lot of time on it, but it's kind of motivated by this figure from Allison showing this theoretical relationship between the wave height at the ice edge and the distance which waves penetrate and even break the ice. And the argument that I'm kind of making in this slide is that the remote sensing definition of the MIZ, which is where concentrations between 15 and 80% is just a definition of convenience from a satellite perspective, because there really, especially around Antarctica, is no solid basis for this sea ice concentration interval versus where waves can penetrate in the ice. So there's a mounting body of work showing that there is no good correlation between this concentration interval and what should be called the marginal ice.
Oh, no.
And some evidence of this comes from Rob Massum's 2008 paper. So there's a 3-week interval between these sea ice concentration maps in 2005, and clearly there's been some northerly winds in between this time compacting the pack ice up against West Antarctica here. And are we to believe that if there was a strong northerly wind compacting this ice up against the coast, that we suddenly go from open ocean to consolidated ice with no marginal ice zone? Effectively, that's what the concentration definition would be saying. Whereas clearly in reality, there's a big fetch over the Southern Ocean, clearly going to be producing some swell, which would penetrate into this ice and probably all the way to the coast. Also, Alberto's great paper with the stereo images showing clearly that there is wave energy in regions of 100% sea ice concentration. Every year goes by and there's more papers published with more and more evidence showing that waves are very happy to penetrate through 100% sea ice concentration. So the argument here is that we need to move away from this remote sensing definition of convenience for the Antarctic MIZ. So back in 1984, Chris Rapley had this first solo author Nature paper, First Observations of the Interaction of Ocean Swell with Sea Ice Using Satellite Radar Altimeter Data. And the way that this worked is they used a radar altimeter, which are kind of built for retrieving the wave height over oceans. And as this altimeter moves from the open ocean into the pack ice and then finally into the consolidated pack, there was a fairly steady decrease in the wave height. And this is what they called the MIZ in their analysis. And in fact, they were able to make these 3-day maps of the wave-affected marginal ice zone. That's indicated with this black border around the ice edge here. In the Southern Ocean, they hatched regions with a greater than 5-meter significant wave height. And you can see that adjacent to regions with a high wave height, we have a deep MIZ, and adjacent to regions without a high wave height, there was a fairly shallow MIZ. So over a 3-day basis, they were able to make these maps of what I'm calling the genuine wave-affected marginal ice zone from an altimeter in the 70s. And then everyone forgot about this work. This paper still only has about 25 citations, I think. It's kind of a paper that fell by the wayside of history, even though the radar altimeters became more sophisticated and more capable. Nobody picked up this technique with those more sophisticated radar altimeters. So as an aside, in 2022, my student Jill, this is work that Alberto referenced yesterday, she studied wave attenuation directly in the Antarctic pack ice using ISAT-2. So this is a laser altimeter. 6-beam laser altimeter, and it's because of its very fine footprint, it can resolve wave passage through sea ice. And by doing so, she studied about 400 of these cloud-free tracks where at the ice edge, there are positive and negative heights corresponding to waves traveling under that ice. And this gets attenuated progressively into the pack ice. And in this particular example, we can see going about 180 kilometers from the edge. This is an example in the Amundsen Sea. This is this track here. So we get the high waves here, attenuating down to basically no waves by about 180 kilometers. And then for the rest of this track, the height contributions come from the ice structure rather than the waves themselves. So we call this the apparent MIZ, and everything else is wave-free. And if you do this for enough tracks, you can build up a picture of the MIZ width indicated on the y-axis here. And she did this in 4 months of 2019. So there's still quite a large manual component in the interpretation of this, which is why she couldn't do it for every month. But in those 4 months, we found that according to ISAT2, the waves were penetrating far deeper than what the sea ice concentration, 15 to 80%, would lead us to believe. The problem is clouds, and when we get clouds, we interrupt the ISAT2 beam, so it's very hard to automate this. So we want to move back towards radar altimeters, as was done in that Rapley paper in 1984. We want to use a modern altimeter, so we use Altica. So Altica is a pulse-limited Ka band radar altimeter. These figures here are from open ocean examples showing how wave height is retrieved in the open ocean. So in the case of a calm open ocean, this altimeter pulse, radar pulse, comes down, intercepts the ocean at the sub-satellite position first, and eventually all around that sub-satellite position up towards the beam width. And so the power that gets returned, this is power as a function of time, very quickly ramps up in a calm ocean, and you get this very steep leading edge to the power waveform. On the other hand, if you're in a wave-affected region, the crests of the waves intercept the incoming power earlier, and the troughs of the incoming wave intercept the incoming power later. What this means is the slope of the leading edge of the power waveform gets spread out because of the presence of those waves. So in Rapley's work, he argued that this works just fine in sea ice covered regions too. So when you have a wave affected sea ice covered area, you get a shallower leading edge to your power waveform. When those waves eventually attenuate, then you get this very peaky and very steep power waveform. So we were very interested to see if this argument worked well with Altica as well. And it does, works awesome. So what we have here is a single subsatellite track from Altica. The top panel shows the waveform, and the color scale is the power returned. And the y-axis here is the range, so essentially the time of each radar pulse. In the open ocean, you can see the leading edge, which is this bottom edge of the waveform here, has a fairly shallow ramp up to maximum power. After we hit the ice edge, this leading edge becomes progressively steeper, and eventually, at some point, this waveform becomes very peaky. What I'm saying is that this inner limit of wave penetration is where the peakiness and the steepness of the leading edge exceeds some threshold. And you can see in this case, indeed, the inner limit of wave penetration happens deeper into the pack than the 80% sea ice concentration contour. Now, this process is very easy to automate, and you can actually roll it out with minimal tweaking of thresholds. And when you do that, you see you get very similar wave penetration depths to Jill Brower's work. So if you take Jill Brower's 4 months and you plot up the results from the radar altimeter in yellow, you can see that we get basically the same wave penetration from the radar as we get from the laser altimeter. So this is kind of confident validation that this technique is working quite well. The other thing we can do is we can match tracks between Altica and ISAT2. And what we see is, so this is a fairly complicated figure here. On the y-axis, we have the correlation coefficient in black and the regression slope in red as a function of the distance between an individual ISAT2 track and an Altica track. And we can see that as we get stricter on the separation between these two tracks, as we approach 0, then the correlation of MIZ width between these two instruments increases. The problem is, as we get stricter on the distance between these two tracks, our statistics get worse. This is as we would expect, because the conjunction between these two tracks is pretty rare with two polar orbiting satellites. But we do certainly exceed the significance threshold for about less than 400 kilometers. So this is another figure that gives us confidence that the radar altimeter is seeing the same thing as the laser altimeter was. Another encouraging thing is the results from Noah Day from University of Adelaide. So he's running size 6 force by WaveWatch 3 and looking at the wave attenuation using Mike's exponential parameterization here, which is just dependent on the concentration. So this shows us for 1 year of 2019, the observed MIZ width from Altica in blue and NOAA's modeled MIZ width from size 6 in green. And we get really close agreement, not only in the magnitude, but also in the seasonality of wave penetration here. So with that, I present to you here a decade-long climatology in Antarctic MIZ width. So this figure here is a Hofmüller from January to December, integrated over these 10 years. And the color scale is the wave-affected MIZ width from Altica. So we see it by longitude here and by time on the y-axis. And I'm calling this the first ever Antarctic-wide MIZ width climatology, but again, that's kind of provocative because there have been MIZ width climatologies before, but I'm just arguing that this one is a more physical representation of waves into MIZ. So for the rest of the talk, I just wanted to drill down into this figure a little bit more and kind of try and understand this seasonality and this regionality a little bit more. So we'll talk about, before we do that, we'll talk about a realistic feature. The reason I'm showing this as a climatology is that each individual year is pretty noisy. And the reason for that is we've only got up to about 30 observations a day spaced all around Antarctica, just because this is from a single satellite. Because of that, it's quite noisy, but what we do see is this consistent diagonally rightward sloping line. And this is basically the passage of storms around Antarctica. And what you can do is you can load up these visualizations that show storms and wave power and wave direction. And you can track these around the continent towards the east as the storms go. And you can see that the MIZ width follows these storms, which is kind of nice. It's something that we hope to see, but I wasn't sure if it would pop out in these individual years, but it kind of does. So again, this gives us more confidence that this measurement is real. Now, talking about seasonality, I want to explain why February is low and the other months are kind of high. And it's really explained quite nicely by these figures from Ian Young's 2020 paper showing the wave climate in the Southern Ocean. So in February, the wave height is fairly small on average, but also the ice edge is a long way south of where the waves are high. So this explains why February is quite low in terms of the MIZ width. Also, there's not much ice to get through in February. So you can't have a 500 kilometer MIZ width in February because there's not 500 kilometers of ice to get through for most of the continent. By about June, the wave height has increased quite a bit, but more importantly, the ice edge has started to reach northerly enough that it's seeing those high wave heights, basically. And this continues all the way through to September. So I think the position of the high waves in relation to the ice edge goes a long way towards explaining this seasonality of low wave heights in February and high wave heights throughout winter and spring. Another thing to note is what happens here to the east of the peninsula and South America. So there's protection from the high waves just by the physical positioning of Drake Passage here. What that ends up giving is lower wave heights in the Western Weddell Sea. And you can kind of see that here straight away. There's a big gap in wave heights here as we go from the Bellingshausen Sea into the Weddell Sea. Talking a little bit more about the regionality, and I kind of want to here explain why there are regions of very deep MIZ right next to regions of fairly shallow MIZ. And I think I finally understand this. We need to talk about the directionality of the incoming waves. So pretty much everywhere in the Southern Ocean at all times of the year, we get waves from the west-northwest. And this is analysis provided by Jin Xiang Liu and Joey Vormans from University of Melbourne using WaveWatch 3 to show the directionality of these waves. So this is taken 1 degree north of the ice edge. Now, if we look at the shape of the ice edge, so my argument here is that the regionality depends on the aspect of the ice edge. So whether that ice edge is facing slightly towards the west or slightly towards the east has a big effect on how deep those waves can penetrate. Because if we've got waves coming from the west-northwest impinging on an ice edge, which has a slightly westerly aspect, then that wave energy is going to enter the pack ice. And you can kind of see that here. So in this region, we have waves kind of intercepting that pack ice. It's not orthogonal, but it's more orthogonal that you would get than on this side, for example. And so what I've done is I've just highlighted 4 regions around the coast where the ice edge has a westerly aspect, which tends to intercept more of this energy. And lo and behold, these 4 regions have high MIZ width in September. This is September, by the way. Conversely, there are 3 regions where the ice edge has an easterly aspect, and these tend to be regions where there is lower MIZ width here. And of course, we have the Western Weddell Sea, which is protected from the higher waves, and that's indicated by red here. So I think I'm getting closer to understanding more features of this Hofmüller diagram by invoking this ice edge aspect argument, which in turn tells us how much of that west-northwesterly wave energy is able to be intercepted by the pack ice. Now, coming on to interannual variability, there's a whole lot here in this data set. So it's a fairly rich data set with, for example, you can see in 2022, there was a huge amount of energy, MIZ width in the Bellingshausen Sea for some reason. I've processed the whole time series now. I'll show that on this slide, and I've collapsed the resolution of this now. I'm showing MIZ width anomalies, so shallower than average MIZ width is now in blue, and deeper than average MIZ width is now in red. And what you can see is some years tend to have less MIZ width, and some years tend to have more MIZ width, as you'd expect. And just in a really brief kind of hand-waving argument, I've illustrated which years had neutral or negative SAM in blue, and positive SAM in red, kind of showing some potential link between SAM and MIZ width here. But this is really early and quick and dirty analysis, showing that there might be some links between SAM and hence wind speed and MIZ width. Extending the time series is a big priority. So we can go back to 2013 with Arctica, but we can go all the way back to the 80s with various different radar altimeters. Just a couple more slides here. So what I'm showing here is PDFs basically of the sea ice concentration at the inner limit of the marginal ice zone. So under the traditional sea ice concentration definition, we would expect that waves would penetrate up to around 80%. So there should be a peak here, and we're not seeing that. So during the advanced season, we get 100% concentration at the inner limit of marginal ice zone. So what this is saying is that the inner limit of the marginal ice zone is almost always deeper than what the concentration definition would tell us. It's a little bit of a different story from November to April, where we get quite a large range of concentrations at the inner limit of marginal ice zone. But what we're not seeing in either the advance or the retreat season is a peak at 80%. So I'm calling this the nail in the concentration definition coffin. And one more figure. So from Chris Horvat's 2020 paper, he used ISAT2 in an automated fashion to look at the wave-affected marginal ice zone width. And so we're able to do the same thing here using Altica. So we've illustrated, this is what percentage of the sea ice zone is marginal. And I've shown that by month here. And what we see is it's around 20% on average across the year, but we get the same kind of seasonality that Chris showed in his 2020 paper. We're a little bit deeper than what Chris showed, and I think that's because of storms. So storms bring high wave heights and also deeper MIZ, but you can't see through storms with the laser altimeter, whereas we can with the radar altimeter. So I think this is why we're getting a wider MIZ than what Chris showed in his 2020 paper. And that brings me to the last slide here. So I think we're now in an era of being able to remotely sense wave-affected marginal ice zone from radar altimeter in a fully automated fashion. And we'll make this data set available for people to play along with. We showed the seasonality and the regionality. I think it's fairly convincingly for the first time for wave-affected marginal ice zone. In the future, Cryosat-2 and Sentinel-3 will give us even higher resolution than what Altica has been able to, and work by Weixin Zhu and Ximing Zhu, published in the Cryosphere, but also rolling it out to Antarctica in the near future, will really push this game forward. But more importantly, I think using past altimeters, we'll be able to use these techniques easily to get a longer term record of wave-affected marginal ice zone around Antarctica. Importantly, there's little correspondence between the sea ice concentration definition and the wave-affected marginal ice zone, as we've suspected for a long time. So with that, I thank you for paying attention. I'm happy to take questions until Mike kicks me off. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alex. Thanks a lot for a great talk and keep perfectly to time.
Alex,
Yes,
can you hear
Vernon.
me? I don't
Yes.
have a microphone. I just wonder.
Loud and clear, Vernon. Yeah.
I guess going back to the original definition of WADM, which I fully accept, is not very helpful.
Did you say the WADM's definition?
Yeah, the WADM's definition.
Yep.
Essentially, the region where open ocean processes are important. I guess I have a sort of philosophical point more than anything. I think what you've done is really good. How do we relate the two? If we go back to MIZ, the whole point of MIZ was to do experiments where we felt there was something interesting happening that was related to the open ocean.
Yep.
You're defining in a very clever way, I think, and a very appropriate way for models and potentially remote sensing where the marginal ice zone ends. How do I relate that to the fact that the marginal ice zone is being affected by open ocean processes? You see what I mean?
Yeah.
At the interior point, am I interested in all these weird processes that also occur in the open ocean? Or is this just a means to an end to keep the modelers happy?
Really good point. So I will note that the WMO have modified their definition as well. So it no longer follows the WADM's definition. The WMO definition from 2014 now explicitly says waves traveling through the pack ice. So again, there's another definition in the mix here. And I know that Fabian would say, you can't really call this the marginal ice zone because like first of all, it's an instantaneous measure of waves penetrating, and it's not necessarily reflective of modifying the pack. Sorry, Fabian, maybe you're not going to say that, but I know that you said that in your review of Jill's paper. So yeah, there's a lot of philosophical questions here, and maybe I'm being too strong in calling this the marginalized zone, and I've kind of tried to qualify that by calling this the wave-affected marginalized zone, and maybe we should call this the instantaneous wave-affected marginalized zone. And also there's a question of sensitivity. Are we seeing the full passage of waves? There's probably waves that are below our detection threshold here and all that kind of thing. And all of these philosophical questions are valid, but I think this is another tool that we can use to define the MIZ. I think it's more physically realistic and relevant in some ways than a concentration definition, but this is not the MIZ for all people, for all times, and for all cases. Yeah, I take that point.
Can I ask another quick question?
Sure.
And this actually betrays my ignorance of the radar altimeter. My recollection, and it could be completely wrong, one of these false memories that emerge when you're my age, is that the pulse limited footprint varies spatially according to the roughness.
Exactly.
How does that integrate into your study?
It's a good question. So for Arctica, it's something like 5 kilometers for a perfectly calm surface, and about 1.5 kilometers depending on the sea state or the ice state, as it was. Either way, we're sampling at least a full wavelength. So yeah, there's processes in here that would affect the waveform, but they're very, very difficult to disentangle. For example, the backscatter that comes from bare ice versus snow-covered ice, the concentration within the footprint, these are all wrapped up in the footprint, but good luck ever retrieving those parameters because it's so complicated.
Mm.
For us, the argument that we cover at least a whole wave period seems to be enough.
Thank you.
We do have time for some more questions.
Can I ask a short question?
Yeah, you should keep it short, Fabian, because you're about to talk.
Yeah, I know. You can take time off my talk if you want. No, that's really great work. I really enjoy your talk, Alex. Just a quick question, because I've recently been in an argument, in a review over this SIG-based definition of the marginalized zone, but it was in the Arctic Ocean.
Yeah.
And they argue that the authors that in the Arctic especially, it is very much appropriate. So have you looked at results in the Arctic as well?
So I haven't, but my colleagues have.
Okay.
If you look up a paper in the Cryosphere, it's published now by Ximing Zhu and Weixin Zhu. I'm sure these last names are pronounced differently, but I can't do it for the life of me. These guys are using Cryosat-2 and Sentinel-3 in the Arctic, and they show big differences between the concentration definition and the wave-affected MIZ. So I think this paper could be exactly what you need. Yeah.
Sounds like it. I might send you an email later to get
the
sure. Properly.
Look forward to it. Thank you.
Thanks.